For 80 years, this B-17 flying fortress carried a dead man. His name was Ernest Vienneau, a young American airman whose job was to guide the bomber across miles and miles of hostile territory.
Navigator, what's the ETA for our target? About 11 minutes.
He was killed instantly when the aircraft was hit by flak on a bombing mission over Europe. In a heavy bomber, the navigator sat in the nose, surrounded by glass and thin aluminium. It was one of the most exposed positions in the aircraft. With nowhere else to place him, the crew laid his body in the narrow tunnel beneath the pilot seats and kept flying. When I first dived this aircraft, he was still there. His body had remained inside since 1944, lying exactly where the crew placed him in the final minutes of the flight. For decades, he remained there, until, sometime after my dive, a formal recovery operation took place. His remains recovered, identified, returned home, and buried where he belonged. The footage you are seeing now comes from after that recovery. The dive I'm talking about came before it. By this stage of the war, American heavy bombers were operating at the very edge of their range. Most launched from large Allied air bases in southern Italy. Long prepared runways built specifically for four-engine aircraft flying deep into occupied Europe. When bombers were damaged over the Balkans or Central Europe, getting back was almost impossible. Crews looked for anywhere they could still reach, and the island of Vis became one of those lifelines. Located on the eastern side of the Adriatic, damaged bombers could use it to avoid a long and dangerous sea crossing. By mid-1944, it had been turned into a forward Allied airbase. An emergency airstrip had been carved out of the island and been brought into use just months before this aircraft was lost. So why did this B-17 not try to land? Because Vis was never a safe airfield for a heavy bomber. The strip was short and rough, built for emergencies, not for damaged four-engine aircraft arriving heavy and compromised. For a B-17 in that condition, a wheels-down landing was a serious gamble. If anything went wrong on approach or touchdown, the aircraft could break apart, collapse its undercarriage, or burn with the crew trapped inside. Ditching near shore was different. It allowed the pilot to control the touchdown, keep the aircraft afloat, and get the crew out quickly with rescue close by. That's why this aircraft did not attempt the runway. It was still flyable, but it wasn't safely landable. And that choice seemed to be a really good one. Although the impact was hard, the aircraft stayed afloat. Every surviving crewman got out, uninjured. Local boats reached the scene and tried to tow the aircraft back towards shore, but it was too badly damaged. As it finally sank, the nose went first and struck the seabed, causing the damage that we can still see today. The rest of the aircraft followed, sliding down the slope behind it. And that explains exactly why we see the wreck as it is today. This isn't an aircraft scattered by violence. It's a wreck laid out by gravity. Now that's a huge difference from one of the other videos that I've got on this channel, the B-24 Lady Luck, which is absolutely smashed to bits by comparison. I'm going to talk about the reasons why later on. But first of all, let's have a look up close at this B-17. And you can see here, this is looking in through the window into the cockpit. It's absolutely incredible. You can see the controls. You can see many of the gauges. You can even see some of the padding from the seats in which the pilots would have sat. This level of detail, after this amount of time, absolutely incredible. One of the other interesting things is that both windows are open, and the reason for that is because that was how the pilots escaped from a ditched aircraft. Moving up there, you can see the upper turret with its two machine guns pointed towards the stern. That little bit there, which is open, that's where the life rafts would have come out. And then up here, this hatch, you can see at the top, which is missing the glass, that's where the majority of the crew would have escaped from. Moving towards the stern now, or the rear of the aircraft, you can see it does actually have a bit of damage there, and that would have been done during the impact. It kind of broke apart a bit. That area there, that just down to the left, that's where the two mid gunners would have been with their 50 caliber machine guns pointing out either side, and those would have been jettisoned before the aircraft came into ditch. It was part of the formal ditching procedure. Heading towards the rear of the aircraft now, this is the deepest point, just about 70 metres, and you can see there the rear turret. Once again, two 50 caliber machine guns on there. The gunner would have looked out of that window and covered, quite a significant arc. Obviously a really important job to keep the fighters away from the back of the aircraft. These aircraft flew in formation, so the gunners would have worked together between multiple aircraft. They established defensive zones and they would cover each other, so they would all try and help each other out. Obviously, that's not what got this B-17. It was hit by flak. As you can see, we're moving forward again past the huge tail on the left-hand side, over the top of the monumental stabilisers, and carrying back towards the cockpit. You can see there's a hole on the left-hand side there. There was a small door there to allow entry and exit to the aircraft. And then moving forward, we can see the waist gunner position again. As I've already said, the guns were ditched. But as you can see, when you look inside, you can see how much stuff there is still in there. You can see the mount just on the bottom left-hand side there. Absolutely incredible. To see how much of this is preserved. Okay, there's a bit of the skin has gone, but frankly, most of the structure is still there, which is just incredible. One of the things you may have noticed when we were peering inside there was the Sperry ball turret. It's still there underneath the aircraft. And I've slowed down the piece of footage looking in through the window and also zoomed in a bit, and you can just see where the ball, or where the top of the ball turret is there. You can see a little bit inside it. Coming out and moving forward, you can see we're up on the wing, onto the starboard wing. You can see there the hole to the left. That's, once again, that's where all the crew escaped from. That little box shape, once again on the left, as I've already said, that's where the life rafts came from. There would have been one on either side, gone out over the wings. The crew would have come out of that radio operator's hatch onto the wings and moved on to the life rafts, apart from the pilots who came out of the windows. And you can see them about to do it in this piece of training footage. Now, all I can say is that those windows aren't very big, and I can imagine exactly how challenging it must have been trying to get out of them, especially if the guys were wearing the full clothing that they would have worn on a bomber mission over Germany when they've got, all the big heavy clothing and all that kind of stuff. But they must have done it because they all got out okay, even though those windows do look really small. Another interesting thing from this angle is you can see how smashed the nose is. And I've already said that's what took the brunt when it hit the seabed. And you can see there the bombardier and navigator's position, which is right in the nose, both completely smashed, both completely gone. And in here is where the body would have been. Now, it's not here when this video was taken because it has been recovered, but we are going to have a look in here and you can see the tunnel where Ernest's body remained for all of those years. Now, one of the things people sometimes ask me is, how do I feel about diving wrecks where people have died? I'll be honest, it doesn't bother me. Death is part of life. We all routinely go to places where people have died, and frankly, where there are still bodies. So I've done any number of battlefield tours. I've been to places like the Somme and Normandy, and there are still bodies there. There are still people missing. And almost certainly if you go to the Somme, for instance, you're walking relatively close to the remains of somebody. To be honest, I don't really have a problem with that, because I think the mere fact that you're there is part of the process of remembering those people. Me diving this wreck, or not diving this wreck, is never going to bring Ernest back to life. But the mere fact that you're listening to me talking about him now means that he's not as forgotten as he might have been otherwise. People will probably know that I'm an ex-military helicopter pilot. I flew on operations. Obviously, none of them were anywhere near as dangerous or as risky or really as important as what Ernest and tens of thousands of his comrades were doing. It does mean, though, that I feel a sense of kinship with them, and I think maybe I get a sense of how they would feel. If this was my B-17 and I'd been in there, would I be pleased that people were still coming to visit me and remember me? Yeah, I think I probably would be. On the other hand, I know there'll be loads of people who feel very differently, and I guess that's the thing. We all have our own opinions, we're all entitled to them, and it's okay to disagree. I think it's also worth talking about the recovery operation that took place. This is something that the Americans take really seriously, and where possible, they always try to bring home their aviators. So there's an organisation called the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, and they go round the world and try to locate, recover, identify service personnel missing from past wars. Obviously, that's a time-consuming, expensive process, but they're aware of the significant number of World War II heavy bomber wrecks that lie around Vis, and they I think are slowly working their way through them. They started off with a B-24 that's a lot shallower than this, I think in about 40 metres, and they then moved on and they've done this one. I'm not sure whether they've got any plans for doing any of the others, but I think one of the problems is that the depth in particular makes this sort of thing really difficult. This one's 70 metres, and quite a lot of the other bombers are much deeper. So the B-24 Lady Luck that I mentioned earlier on, that's 90 odd metres. To do work at those depths, to dive at those depths, is risky and dangerous and very expensive. And I'm not really clear, when we say there's a body on this wreck, I don't think there's very much. I don't think they found very much. But I guess it's important to them, and where they can, they'll do as much of it as possible. Ultimately, they have to balance the cost, the risk against, how good it is to bring somebody home. What I want to do now is quickly return to something I've mentioned already, the B-24. So I've talked about the B-24 Lady Luck, which is the subject of another one of my videos. And if you haven't seen it, obviously, I think you'll really enjoy it. And I'll put a link in the description and above. But the B-24 is really interesting because what it shows is a very different sort of crash site to this one. And more importantly, a very different tale. On this B-17, all of the crew who were there for the landing survived. The only casualty, Ernest, occurred, when they were actually on the mission. The B-24 is very different. All 10 crew members were alive at the start of the landing process. Only one of them survived. And that is down to the differences between the way that the B-24 and the B-17 performed when they landed on water. And it's an absolutely incredible thing, especially considering that the wrecks are only a few miles apart. They landed at a very similar time, in relatively similar circumstances. And the reason is that the B-24 were notoriously poor at ditching. They had a high wing and a slab-sided fuselage, which meant that even a well-executed ditching often ended violently. Instead of skimming across the surface, the nose dug in and basically the aircraft broke apart very violently into two bits. By contrast, the B-17 had a low wing and a big surface area, and what that meant is that you could ditch it much more smoothly, and because of that they were far more likely to stay intact and even float, as we saw in this situation. So it's incredible. Two aircraft, very similar size, very similar roles, completely different performance when ditched. And this was obviously all about design rather than crew skill or anything else. The B-24 was designed to carry more bombs, and it could carry significantly more bombs than a B-17, depending on the range and the amount of fuel, but up to twice as much bomb load, which when you consider that they had the same crew, they were a similar sort of size, that's why the American High Command was, preferred the B-24 to the B-17. What was the trade-off for that? Well, the trade-off was the B-17 was probably more survivable, and it was definitely more survivable when it came to ditching on water. So really interesting thing there that the Americans prioritised this ability to, I guess, deliver effect to the enemy over their own crew's survivability. Nothing shows that better than the two wrecks that we see here on the seabed in Vis. The completely intact B-17, in which everybody survived the landing, versus the B-24 Lady Luck, what a name, where everybody survived up until the moment of the impact, and then only one person lived to tell the tale. It's a fascinating contrast, and as a diver, an absolute privilege to be able to witness these things and to understand exactly what happened. I mean, the simple fact is, these wrecks don't need drama adding to them. Everything that matters is already here. You can see the damaged aircraft. You can see how the crew made the decisions. We can talk about the navigator who never made it out, and the aircraft that carried that moment with it for decades. The evidence was preserved here in the sea. We can see how the aircraft was ditched, how the crew escaped, and understand why it lies exactly as it does today. I think I'd also like to thank the work of those who came later, because they've closed one part of the story. The aircraft, though, still remains where it fell, silent. But the man who guided it across the sky is no longer here. He's home, probably back where he belongs. For me, I think dives like this really matter. Not necessarily for the depth, not for the difficulty, but because I feel that they connect us directly to, really important events, real decisions that were made by real people under pressure. And so I think it's fair to say this isn't just a B-17 on the seabed. It's not just a beautifully preserved wreck. It's not just an incredible dive, although it is all of those things as well. It's actually the last chapter of a journey that began in the air and ended right here. I'm Dom Robinson, Deep Wreck Diver. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.